Hvala dr. za njegovo predstavitev. Jaz mislim, da smo dobili obilico zanimivih informacij in pa hkrati tudi mečkeno optimizma, da dejansko res prihaja doba tranzicije, ko bomo sedanja prohibicijo oziroma govor o prohibiciji lahko zamenjali z besedami regulacija. Pravzaprav nadaljujemo z naslednjim govorcem, zadnji, ki se nam bo danes predstavil, oziroma zadnji, ki predstavlja svoje izkušnje in mnenje, je pravzaprav zagovornik pravic uporabnikov konoplje. Priča na številnih zaslišanjih, sodeloval na številnih konferencah, pisal članke, trenutno pa je partner pri odvetniški družbi Vicente Sederberg in pomočnik direktorja Sensibil Kolorado. S predavanjem Legalizirana konoplja, začetek konca prohibicije konoplje v ZDA in drugod, nas bo sedaj razveselil gospod Kappel. Prosim za velik aplavz.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. I gotta figure out how to read the appropriate language here to get the PowerPoint working. Aha. My name is Kappel. I'm from Denver, Colorado. I'm an attorney with the law firm Vicente Sederberg. And I've also been working at a nonprofit, Sensible Colorado. And in both of those capacities, we've been advocating for both medical cannabis patients and also for recreational users. And first though, I do want to thank 1A and all the great organizers who brought me out here. They've been great hosts, and I want to thank you all for coming. In my capacity in Colorado, I helped draft Amendment 64, which was the ballot initiative that legalized marijuana for those over the age of 21. I also helped run the campaign and also helped implement the law. Not just me, though. We had a very good team of people. And so what I want to talk to you guys about today is briefly about marijuana prohibition in the states, early reforms of how we got to where we are, how we ran our campaign, and then sort of the issues we're still facing. So briefly, the history of marijuana laws in the US, it started by the states. There's 50 states and there's a federal government, and the states started prohibiting marijuana early in 1910. And then it was, in 1937 that the federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which was a way they didn't think they could prohibit marijuana, so they thought they would just tax it exorbitantly so no one would use it. But it really wasn't until 1970, with the Controlled Substance Act, that the federal government decided to regulate all drugs. And what they did is they, kind of like here, they made a schedule of drugs where certain drugs were classified as more harmful and certain drugs were allowed to be prescribed. And they put marijuana in the Schedule 1 that says it has no medicinal value. And they did that on a temporary basis. It was only supposed to be temporary. And they had this commission that they put together, the Schaefer Commission, to study what schedule it should be in. And the Schaefer Commission comes back, and the Schaefer Commission says, you know what, it shouldn't be in Schedule 1. In fact, it may not even need to be scheduled at all. But the federal government, like a reoccurring theme that you'll hear, is they just ignored the Schaefer Commission. They continued to prosecute and prohibit marijuana, and that's sort of where we are. That's how it went for a nice 30, 40 years. And it was under Reagan, they came out with the Just Say No campaign and really tried to prohibit marijuana use. The thing though about the federal government and the states that you have to understand is that the federal government really goes after only large-scale drug users, or drug traffickers, really. And the states, on the other hand, comprise 99% of all drug enforcement. So all drug arrests, 99% of them are done by the states, and about maybe 1% are done by the federal government. And that's important to remember as we talk about this, because although we legalized marijuana in Colorado, we have not legalized marijuana at the federal level yet. So it's still technically illegal, but it's tolerated. And so, after the federal government, created the Controlled Substance Act, this is the current penalties for marijuana, the estimated penalties. A lot of states mimicked these same sort of penalties. And what you see here is that, just possessing marijuana under federal law can land you a year in jail, a $1,000 fine. Any sale, can result in 5 years in jail and a $250,000 fine. Now, there is some discretion with the judges to deviate. You know, they can give you probation or they can increase it based off of various factors. It's kind of like the discretion that judges have here. But overall, these penalties, these laws, are still in effect today at the federal government level. And there's many folks over the years who tried to change federal law. You know, this was a case where they petitioned to reschedule marijuana from a different schedule. A judge with the DEA agreed that it should be rescheduled. But what did the federal government do? They ignored it. They ignored it because that's just what they've done. And you know, and there's another recent case, you know, maybe a couple months ago in the courts trying to reschedule marijuana at the federal level. Again, the courts sided with the federal government, and the federal government just sort of went on their way with marijuana prohibition. So what did we do? We went to the states. You know, in the 70s, there's a movement among the states to decriminalize marijuana, decriminalize possession. And then there's sort of a movement, a local movement in cities in the US to really affirmatively permit medical cannabis usage. And we saw the first one in San Francisco in 1991. There was one in Breckenridge, Colorado, one in Oakland. All these local initiatives sort of paved the way for the states to move forward. And the state initiatives, the first one that's really noteworthy is in California in 1996. They passed the Compassionate Use Act, which was the first state law that what it did is it said, look, we are no longer arresting, we are no longer prosecuting medical cannabis users and their providers. And since states make up 99% of all drug arrests, that effectively stopped 99% of all drug arrests in California. And so other states followed suit. And today, we have 22 states and the District of Columbia that have a medical cannabis law in the US. And there's 2 states, the 2 in purple, Colorado in the middle there, and Washington up in the corner, that have passed laws to allow all adults over the age of 21 to use and possess and acquire marijuana. And then there's also 5 more states that have passed CBD-only bills, which more or less CBD is still considered a drug under federal law. And they've passed these bills to, it's a very limited medical cannabis bill that have been passed in very conservative states. And so let's talk about Colorado. How did we get to where we are today, where they're selling marijuana and you can just walk into a store? In 2000, the people of Colorado voted on Amendment 20, which allowed medical cannabis, which gave protections to medical cannabis users. In 2006, we ran a Denver initiative to decriminalize marijuana in Denver, Colorado, one city. And we also ran a statewide campaign to decriminalize marijuana across the whole state. The statewide campaign failed, but that was okay, because our point in running that campaign wasn't actually to win. Our point was to talk about marijuana, because the more we talked about marijuana, the more the public understood about marijuana prohibition, the more people supported what we were doing. So by losing, we actually won. And so in 2009, there's more local initiatives. We ran marijuana decriminalization initiatives in Breckenridge, Colorado, in Netherlands, and in a few other places. And then it was in 2009, after Obama got elected, that things really started to speed up. Obama, came out with this memorandum, the Ogden Memo, that said, look, as the federal government, if you are in clear compliance with your state's laws, we will not prosecute you, is more or less what this memo said. And what that ended up doing is it really gave the green light for states to create a whole new system. And then in 2010, based off of that green light, we created a brand new regulated medical cannabis system, which I'll talk about here in a minute. 2011, we refined that system. 2012, we passed Amendment 64, which I'll get into in a minute. And 2013, we sort of passed a bunch of bills to sort of create, with Amendment 64, we sort of built the house, and then in 2013, it was more of us painting the house, of what it looked like. And so, Amendment 20, real quickly, it allowed patients and their immediate caregiver to grow 6 plants and possess 2 ounces of marijuana. And they had a defense in court if they had more than that. For people who used the Rick Simpson oil or other, severe illnesses, that needed more than 6 plants, they had a defense in court. And then, you know, what happened in 2009 with Obama's memo is that we had what a lot of people dubbed the green rush. All sorts of people started opening up marijuana businesses in Colorado. At the peak of it, we probably had about 1,000 different marijuana businesses throughout the state. And they were completely unregulated, and they were based off of this notion of a patient and a caregiver. And somehow that legal notion, you know, we pushed forward as providing protections for these businesses, even though in the back of our heads, we knew that the protection was a little flimsy because the law that we were using as our shield didn't talk about businesses. It didn't talk about employees. And so we weren't in necessarily clear and unambiguous compliance with state law as Obama wanted. And so we fought for sensible regulations. And it was a hard fight. For really two reasons. You know, we had two main opponents. On one hand were folks who did not want to regulate marijuana at all. They thought marijuana should be absolutely free, no regulations whatsoever. On the other hand, we had the law enforcement and the establishment who just didn't want to talk about marijuana and just hated marijuana. And we were trying to go straight up the middle and say that, no, we need sensible regulations. If we want to be in clear compliance with state law, we need licenses. If this is medicine, it needs to be regulated. And that was our position. And so we got heat from both sides, but at the end of the day, we won. And we created, you know, arguably what was the world's first, you know, for-profit regulated medical cannabis system, you know, that wasn't regulated. It was regulated by the states. So it's definitely the countries, I don't know about the world's. And with it, though, we had to make a bunch of compromises. And it was tough, but there was, you know, it's part of moving the ball forward was compromising. So there's restrictions on who could own these businesses. Certain local governments, you know, banned these businesses. Other ones permitted them. In order to have a grow facility, you also had to have a store, or you had to have a products manufacturing facility. And we learned a lot of lessons from our early medical cannabis days, which really wasn't that early. This is about 4 years ago. But you know, there's a bunch of advertising that was in people's faces that led to sort of pushback, and it also led to advertising bans. There was, if you look, there's a, you know, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a high concentration of marijuana businesses just in Denver alone, which led to very restrictive zoning laws going forward. And our regulators, the regulators that we had, they were audited, and it came back that they didn't have enough money to actually do their job. And so, you know, moving forward, you know, there's a lot of focus on actually funding the regulatory entity. And so let's talk, you know, so that was our medical cannabis system. Our medical cannabis system was in place in 2010. And, you know, with that, you know, just to give you guys a framework, there's sort of three pieces of the medical cannabis system. There's stores that sold medical cannabis, there's the grow facilities, and then there's the infused products manufacturers. Now, but we knew that medical cannabis wasn't enough for us. You know, at the end of the day, if, you know, pushing forward on just the medical cannabis side of things would have resulted in medical cannabis being regulated by the FDA and sold and grown by big pharmaceutical companies, because that's how we treat medicine in our society. And so we had to go a step further. We had, you know, and you know, we thought that, we had to go a step further for a number of reasons, which I'll get into. But let me tell you quickly about the process. So in Colorado, you know, we had no luck really with the legislature, with our elected officials of trying to pass marijuana legalization. But we have a tool in Colorado where we can collect enough signatures and have a public vote on a measure, and that vote, or that law that people vote on, becomes law. And so in this case, Amendment 64, they call it an Amendment 64 because it was the 64th Amendment to the Colorado Constitution. And in order to get there, we had to collect 200,000 signatures. And, you know, once those signatures were verified, you know, they set it for a vote to the people. And so our audience in this case was the people of Colorado. And so everything we did, you know, our overall strategy was to focus on the people of Colorado, was to focus on the discussion of what do the people in Colorado want, what messages resonate with them, and how do we win? And so we had sort of a four-pronged strategy. One was polling. We did a bunch of polling to see what the people in Colorado wanted. The second one was the grassroots, which I don't know if that's a term that's used frequently around here, but it was really just talking to everyone, networking with everyone about marijuana, and really talking about why we need to pass this. The other one is grass tops, which is sort of getting endorsements from elected officials, from getting endorsements from NGO leaders, from pastors, from anyone who people listen to, we would seek their endorsement. And we built this very broad coalition. And the fourth piece is media. We did everything we could do to get in the media. Our philosophy was, if you're talking about marijuana, it's good. And so we did we both paid for advertisements, but we also did some, earned media sort of stunts. We would do certain things that were just so outlandish that the media would have to cover us. And I'll talk about those. And this was our main message, that marijuana is safer than alcohol. Does it contribute to overdose deaths? No. Long-term health problems? No. Violent crimes? No. Serious injuries? No. Now, is there harms with marijuana? Yes. But are those harms worse than alcohol? No. And so that was sort of our main message, because we had a bunch of, we had a lot of research that showed that if people understood that marijuana was less harmful or as harmful as alcohol, they would support legalizing marijuana. And so that was the main thrust of our messaging. And so first is, what do people want? We did tons and tons of polling and drafting our measure. And a lot of these sort of restrictions in Amendment 64 were placed there because it was what the people of Colorado wanted. We did polling to ask them. And so let me tell you about what Amendment 64 does. It says that it's not unlawful, it cannot be a crime by the state of Colorado or by any local government for those 21 years of age to possess, use, display, purchase, or transport marijuana accessories, which is pipes, bongs, etc., or an ounce or less of marijuana. And then you could also, each person over 21 could also grow 6 plants with 3 flowering, 3 non-flowering. And hopefully, I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, if I can only possess an ounce of marijuana, hopefully I grow more than that with my 6 plants. Well, you can. You can grow, you can keep everything that you grow. And the other restriction is you have to grow the marijuana in an enclosed locked space. You can't grow it outside. You can grow it in a greenhouse, or you can grow it in a room, but you can't grow it just on your balcony. The other piece is that you can give marijuana away. We made it express so you can just give it away. If you don't take any money, you can just give an ounce to whoever you want to. Well, by whoever you want to, someone over 21. And you can consume marijuana, but you can't do it if it's openly and publicly. And no one quite knows what openly and publicly means. And so, different local governments have treated this differently. Some say, if you're on private property, you're fine. Others say, if you're on private property, but you're standing right by the sidewalk, you're not fine. Others say, if you're in a certain establishment, you're okay. And so it varies, and this is sort of one of the issues we're facing moving forward is, where do people use marijuana? And then the other thing it allowed you to assist someone with any of the things I just talked about. So you can help someone smoke marijuana, or you can help someone grow marijuana. And that was just really, making sure that we covered, all the possibilities. The other piece that it did is that it created marijuana establishments, marijuana stores. Similar to our medical marijuana system we had at the time, it made retail marijuana stores, marijuana cultivation facilities, and retail product manufacturing facilities. These are the facilities that make cookies, lotions, hash, breathalyzers, etc. And marijuana testing facilities. We built marijuana testing facilities into the law as a public health issue. And finally, the final thing it did is it legalized industrial hemp in the state of Colorado, which is separate than marijuana. And so this is the measure that we drafted based off of polling. And and our arguments that we used during the campaign was, like I just mentioned, that marijuana is objectively less harmful than alcohol, and that if it's objectively less harmful than alcohol, then adults who make a rational choice to use marijuana over alcohol shouldn't be criminalized for it. Our other arguments was that, alcohol prohibition in the states led to tons of violent crime, and so does marijuana prohibition, and they're both ineffective. And then, another argument is we try to co-opt the opposition's argument. The opposition always talks about the children. What about the children? What about the children? Well, our thought was the problem with marijuana prohibition is that drug dealers don't ID anyone. They don't ask for IDs. They don't check ages. And they also sell other drugs. So if we really cared about the children, we'd take marijuana off of the streets and we'd put it behind the counter. And that was one of our main arguments. The other sort of piece was the economy. We built in there that the first $40 million in tax revenue raised would go to public schools. And we also, talked about how many jobs would be created. Today, we've created about 10,000 to 15,000 jobs based off of this measure. So we were correct, and all of our arguments were pretty much correct. And then there's the whole industrial hemp, which is a whole nother piece. And then our final argument was that Colorado could do this, despite federal law being that marijuana was illegal. The people of Colorado could do this. And so what was our messaging? It was pretty much those arguments, but we were we made sure we always stayed on message. We never talked about any other drugs. We only talked about cannabis because we didn't want to get distracted. We set the age limits at 21 as opposed to 18 because we didn't want to talk about how old someone should be. We made sure all we were talking about was adults can responsibly use marijuana and they shouldn't be criminalized for it. And so, and our other arguments as well. So this is an example of one of the billboards we had. It's a father standing around his son saying, "Please card my son." And it sort of reiterates that drug dealers don't ID. He just wants a regulatory system. This picture of the girl, it was a video that we had. She, wrote a message to her mom that says, when I'm out at a party, I feel safer if people are using marijuana as opposed to drinking alcohol because they're violent when they drink alcohol. And that was the whole message of it. There was this one where we were just trying to normalize, marijuana use, And she's like, for many reasons, I prefer marijuana over alcohol. And if you can see, it's right above a liquor store. And this one, Pat Robertson, who kind of looks like George Bush, is an old Christian conservative, and he came out and said that he would support legalizing marijuana. And so, of course, we put his face on a billboard and put it up there, and then he called us a couple days later and asked that we take it down. And we also brought out specific groups. In building our coalition, we tried to get every person possible. We wanted them in the media, because we wanted people to feel safe that they could support marijuana prohibition, or ending marijuana prohibition. So, every single type of group we tried to have a press conference about. And sure, not all women in this case supported ending marijuana prohibition, but by announcing that some do, it gives space for others to. And so we had one with women. We had one with veterans with PTSD. In Colorado, our medical cannabis rules only allowed prescriptions for certain ailments. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't one of them. And so we filed petitions over and over again with the state to have them add it, and they denied us every time. And so running up to the campaign, we're like, oh, if we file a petition, they're going to deny us. And when they do deny us, we're going to call for the legalization of marijuana across the board because our medical system is broken. And that is exactly what happened. And we had, the medical marijuana community come out. That was, right there is Gary Johnson. He ran for president, and he had a press conference in a medical marijuana business. We also had conservatives, which I mentioned, come out. We had social justice folks come out. Anna Marie is the president of the National Association, or the NAACP. It's a civil rights organization, and she was talking about not only were there 210,000 marijuana arrests in Colorado in the last 15 years, but most of those are African Americans and people of color. And so we brought the civil rights and social justice arguments into this. And then we had other groups as well. We had professors, we had pastors and clergymen, we had doctors come out. law enforcement officials, businesses, economists, nonprofit fiscal policy folks, and the unions as well. Mostly because the unions wanted to organize the industry that we were about to create. And of course, we use social media for everything, because our target in a lot of cases was young people. So we did cute gimmicks to remind people to vote. Our opposition was well-financed. They had about, $750,000. It was every single prior governor of Colorado came out against us. Pretty much all of our elected officials came out against us. The children's advocates came out against us. Most of the current law enforcement came out against us. But that's not necessarily fair because they couldn't come out in favor of us while they're in law enforcement. So they only came out against us. And then this group, Project SAM, also came out against us. And they had a offshoot in Colorado called Smart Colorado. And what they advocated for was they said, all right, we won't criminalize marijuana users. Instead, we'll force them to go to treatment as sort of their middle ground. And this, to us, was just as unethical as criminalizing marijuana users. And it just made no sense. And they were also funded by the treatment professionals. So it's kind of a self-serving group. And so what happened? Well, we won, which is what, otherwise I wouldn't be talking today. But we on election night we actually ended up receiving 55% of the vote. This is a picture of our election night party, and we received more votes in Colorado. There's more votes to legalize marijuana than voted for President Obama. And so it was we were very happy with the results. We thought we would win, but we didn't think we would win by that much. But winning just started all the work. Sort of what happened from then, is really where everything gets juicy. It passes in November, but it doesn't go into effect until the governor signs it. He signs it on December 10th, and he makes a task force made up of medical professionals, of doctors, of law enforcement, of child advocates, of judges, of everyone he can think of to put on a task force. And this task force put together a 200-page report about how they thought marijuana recreational sales should happen in Colorado and how this industry should be regulated. And we, in our measure, we had a very tight timeline of when this measure had to go into effect. So it was a quick task force, and then they sent it to the state legislature, who put together another task force to discuss all the same issues again. And then finally, the legislature passes their measure. The state, and they created a body, the Marijuana Enforcement Division. That'd be the regulatory entity that regulated this new industry. And so the Marijuana Enforcement Division created their regulations of what this looked like. And then October 1st of 2013, applications were open to apply for and open a new recreational marijuana business. And just for everyone's clarification, in December 2012, when the governor signed it, that's when the criminal protections went into effect. That's when it was legal to possess an ounce and legal to grow 6 plants. And then January 1st, 2014 is when the first recreational marijuana stores were open to the public. But before we got there, after we passed Amendment 64, the Colorado legislature enacted all of these bills, to think of every possible thing that could go wrong and try and cover it. And at the time, we had, we were working heavily in the state legislature, and there's many people working heavily in the state legislature. There was folks who hated marijuana, there's the industry who wanted to profit off of it, there was the unions who wanted to unionize it, and then there was us who just wanted good policy moving forward. And so, I don't necessarily have to go through all of these bills, but, in short, I think there's a couple key ones to point out. The first two bills are, about the regulatory system, which I'll dive into in a little bit. The third bill, the tax bill, enacted a 25% excise tax from the grow facility to the retail store. And it also enacted a 10% excise tax on the retail sales of marijuana. The fourth bill just changed Colorado's criminal law. And the next three bills were just sort of cleanup bills on the regulatory, the regulatory system. But the last bill is key, the DUID bill. And this is an issue that every single place that legalizes marijuana will have to face. What do people do about driving? And driving while impaired, like what are the restrictions? And so in Colorado, prior to this, there's no limit. If you had marijuana in your blood, they could charge you with driving while impaired, or THC in your blood. And so with this, we set a limit of 5 nanograms, but it wasn't a hard limit. Unlike in Washington, Washington set a 5 nanogram limit. It's 5 nanograms per whole liter of blood. Washington set a hard limit where if you had that amount in your blood, you're automatically guilty of the crime of driving while impaired. In Colorado, we set the limit, if you have 5 nanograms of THC in your blood, then they can presume you're impaired, but you can go in front of a judge or a jury and tell them, this is why I'm not impaired. I'm a medical user. I always am going to have 5 nanograms of marijuana in my blood. I use creams or lotions, et cetera. So, it's not a hard rule like it was in Washington, but either way, I don't think 5 nanograms is an exact number. There's still a lot more science that needs to be done about what does it mean to drive while you're impaired. And then the final piece was a child endangerment study. This started off as a child endangerment bill where they wanted to criminalize parents with children who were using marijuana. And we successfully diverted that into, how about we just have a study about it? And so, what sort of regulations do we have in our system? And, a lot of times, I think it's key that to talk about this piece, and a lot of people don't like the regulations, and frankly, a lot of them are overbearing and not necessary. But there is a new opportunity that we have here with regulating marijuana that we've never had before, especially when it comes to public health. And the first piece, the first regulation was who can own one of these businesses. There was, and this is a point of contention both internally with myself and internally in our movement. But what they decided on in Colorado was that they wanted people with good moral character, with no criminal felonies, and no government debt. And you also had to be a resident of Colorado as well. They also wanted certain security requirements. They wanted tracking systems to track the marijuana from when you planted the seed in the ground until you sold it. They wanted everything on video, that was, backed up, that could be accessed. The MIDS tracking system is part of their seed-to-sale tracking system. They also wanted, to measure waste. They didn't want people just throwing marijuana out in the dumpster for kids to grab. So they had specific waste requirements and specific transportation requirements. There's also requirements for diversion and misuse of marijuana. Like we said the whole time, you have to show an ID to buy marijuana. There's also limits on out-of-state purchases. So in Colorado, as you saw on the map before, Colorado is the only state that has legal marijuana, and all the other states don't. And so the fear was that all the marijuana would just go from Colorado to the rest of the country. And so we responded and we said, all right, well, we'll make it so if you don't live in Colorado, you can only buy 8 grams of marijuana at a time instead of 28 grams of marijuana if you do live in Colorado. And is marijuana still leaving the state? Yes. But in this case, if you wanted to go to a bunch of different stores and try and buy a kilo of marijuana total, you're gonna have to go to 4 times as many stores. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. Also, there's undercover programs of people going in and trying to buy marijuana without an ID to make sure that people were actually, they were actually checking IDs. We also had testing and sanitation requirements. All the marijuana that you grow has to be put in batches, and each part of the batch has to be tested, both for mildews and pesticides, but also for the strength of the marijuana. And the testing program is just now going into effect. And there's also certain sanitation requirements that you had in both the grow facility and in these products manufacturing facilities. One piece that may have, there's also labeling and packaging requirements. And with, one piece that may be not necessary, but I think, in the short term it is that all the marijuana has to be placed in child-proof packaging. And this was sort of, a compromise that we reached with these child advocates who are saying, well, they're eating all these children are accidentally getting into their parents' brownies and then they're ending up in the hospital. And so we're like, all right, fine, we'll put it in child-proof packaging. There's also advertising restrictions in Colorado. In Uruguay and in Washington, they've banned advertising altogether. In Colorado, we have limited advertising. You can't appeal to minors, you can't engage in certain mass marketing campaigns, and you can't advertise anywhere where more than 30% of the audience could be under the age of 21. DUIDs we already talked about. There is a flaw in our law where they tried to pass this open container requirement. Kind of like in the States, you can't drive with an open beer in the car. They wanted to make it so you couldn't drive with an open container of marijuana. The problem is no one knows what a closed container of marijuana looks like. So, that's still being worked through. Then they added marijuana to the Clean Indoor Air Act. They said, wherever you can't smoke tobacco, you can't smoke marijuana. Now, that doesn't mean the opposite of wherever you can smoke tobacco, you can smoke marijuana. That's not what it means at all. And then there's edibles. And edibles has been sort of the ongoing problem that we have now. And the edible problem is twofold. And we've been working hard on this. One is there's an issue with people who took normal everyday candies and they would spray them with marijuana and then they'd package them up and they would sell them as edible marijuana products. The problem is that no one knew if they were eating marijuana products or not marijuana products because there's nothing on the product that identified it as having marijuana in it. And so this year they passed a bill that said if it's a marijuana brownie, you have to have something on the actual brownie itself that signifies that it has marijuana in it. And then there's also the other pieces with edibles is limiting serving sizes. They said that, you can only have the state came up with 10 milligrams of THC being one serving of THC. Now, whether that's accurate or not, I think is up for debate. But they said that you can only have 100 milligrams of THC in one package. That was their initial take on this. But they ended up changing that because 100 milligrams of THC in one brownie turned out to be too much. And I'll get into that in a minute. But anyways, those are all the regulations. And on January 1st, we had the first sales of recreational marijuana in the United States. And there was long, long lines. And the sort of media around it was perfect. There was long lines and no problems. People lined up, bought marijuana, and went home. It was exactly what we wanted. And initially, there was only a few marijuana stores, and so the price of marijuana was really high. It was about $20 a gram. Today, the price of recreational marijuana is about, on the low end, is about $7 a gram. So the price has dropped substantially since the first day. And so the unresolved issues, what is still out there? Well, like I mentioned, we have the edibles. We have the edible issue, and we're looking to regulate it so in each cookie or each brownie, there's only one serving, and then if you want more marijuana to eat, you can eat more cookies, and maybe work out a little bit more. The other big piece is where do you smoke marijuana at? And this is sort of the current debate: is where do you use it? There's a lot of adults who don't want to use marijuana at their house because they have kids, or they live with their parents, or they just don't want to use it at their house. Or there's people who come to Colorado, maybe from Slovenia, and they want to use marijuana somewhere, and they don't have a house to smoke it in. Or their hotel they're staying at is not a non-smoking hotel. And so where do you go? And that's sort of an unresolved issue that we're trying to figure out. Part of it is a lot of these elected officials, they're like, they keep telling me, they say, oh, we're so sick of people smoking marijuana in the park. We're so sick of people smoking marijuana on the streets. And I say, well, why don't you give them a place where they can smoke marijuana? And then they stop complaining about that issue. The other piece is employment protections. Our measure didn't provide employment protections, and so in the States, a lot of people lose their jobs based off of testing positive for marijuana, and that's still an issue that we're trying to resolve. And there's a court case in front of the Colorado Supreme Court that says that's about this paraplegic who works at a satellite network television, and all of his employment reviews have been, he's an outstanding employee, He failed the drug test for using medical marijuana, and they fired him. And so, that case is currently pending in front of the Colorado Supreme Court, and we don't know which way it's going to go. The other issue is children. We've been focusing a lot in Colorado on creating a public education campaign to limit marijuana use among young people. And there's been some successes in the States with tobacco. When they've ran public education campaigns with tobacco, they've limited its use. And so that's what we're hoping to replicate with marijuana. But it's still, the funding's still being put in place. There's also driving, as we mentioned. The 5 nanograms, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Then there's banking, which is a big issue. Since this is still illegal under federal law, and the banks are regulated by the federal government, a lot of banks haven't wanted to bank with this industry. And so that creates a huge problem of having massive amounts of cash on hand. And it's a massive public safety issue. And we are working to resolve it, and there's some banks who are finally, just as of last week, taking a few marijuana business accounts. But it's still a massive issue that's really based off of the federal government. And another massive issue with the federal government is taxes. The federal government doesn't let anyone deduct normal business expenses if they consider them trafficking a controlled substance. And so none of these businesses can deduct normal business expenses, and so they end up paying double the amount of taxes as a normal business, in addition to the other taxes we already tacked on. And so then, we have the federal government, and this is sort of the biggest issue, because everything's still illegal under federal law. If the federal government wanted to, they could come in and they could arrest everyone who's selling marijuana, and they could try and shut it all down. I don't think they will. I think there's too many people. There's, like I mentioned, 10,000 to 15,000 people working in this industry in Colorado. That doesn't even include the accountants and the lawyers and the people who make the grow lights and and the government employees who are regulating this industry. We have about probably 100 government employees who just regulate marijuana in Colorado. So I don't think the federal government is going to go backwards, but they could. But because it's still illegal at the federal level, there's many issues with, like I mentioned, banking, taxes. There's issues with water, which is also controlled by the federal government. But there's hope. There's definitely still hope with the federal government. Last week, there's a very, very key vote where the federal government, the U.S. Congress, voted to defund the DEA from going after medical cannabis groups, which is very historic. They've tried to pass this vote for the last 15 years, and they finally passed it. There's still, still has to be signed into law, but at least that's a step on the medical cannabis side, not necessarily the recreational marijuana side. And there's also international law, which was touched on already, but there's a lot of treaties that have to be changed. There's a lot of pieces with international law. And so, briefly, I want to just compare, and for some reason, my slide got messed up. This is supposed to say Uruguay in this side. And there was something up there that said Uruguay, I promise. But more or less, the main differences between Washington and Colorado and Uruguay, the main differences between Colorado and Washington is that Washington doesn't allow home cultivation. You can't grow marijuana on your own in Washington. And they also have an automatic DUI provision, which I briefly talked about. And their stores aren't open yet. So if you go to Washington looking for marijuana, you won't be able to get it yet. Well, at least not in a store. In Uruguay, as is already mentioned, there's 3 different ways to buy marijuana, from a pharmacy, from a club, or you can grow your own, or 3 different ways to acquire it. The interesting thing about Uruguay is that there's no out-of-state purchases. If you go to Uruguay, you can't acquire marijuana, but if you go to Colorado, you can. And in Uruguay, they're more permissive of where you can use it. They say you can use marijuana wherever you can use tobacco. Oh, there. I guess it popped up at the end. And so what's next? Well, with this vote, will, the U.S. end their prohibition on medical cannabis? Possibly. I think we're headed in that direction. Will more states legalize marijuana for recreational uses? Yes, I think so. We'll see Alaska in 2014. We'll probably see Florida legalize medical cannabis in 2014, possibly Oregon legalize recreational cannabis in 2014. And then in 2016, we'll probably see California or Massachusetts and other states, follow suit. There's also these CBD bills that, are moving at lightning speed in the states, where they're just allowing CBD-only sort of marijuana strains and CBD-only, sort of medical cannabis strains, or CBD-only sort of marijuana products, mostly for folks with seizures. There's been 5 of these bills passed in the last year. There's probably going to be another 5 passed soon. And is there more countries? Is Portugal, going to legalize marijuana soon, or Jamaica, or Spain, or will the Netherlands come all the way, or maybe Slovenia soon? And so, and international law, I think, international law is changing. There's a big conference in 2016. The Assembly of I'm going to butcher this one, but it's the Commission on Narcotics Drugs, their assemblies in 2016. And I think we're starting to see some divisions of what's going on there, and maybe we'll see some new policies. And so, that sort of concludes what I have to talk about. But I do want to leave you with this. What we found in Colorado was that the more we talked about marijuana in the public, the more we were in the news, the more we talked to our friends about it, the more we talked to our parents about it, the more people's minds changed. And so that's what I would say here, is that the more you talk about it, the more you change the public discussion, the more you can get out there and really just talk about it, the quicker this is going to change. And so with that, I want to thank you all again for having me, and I look forward to answering any questions you have later on. Thank you.